Hi, thanks for the introduction, Yannick, and thanks to everyone involved in the organisation of the CJE conference. You might know a little bit of apprehension in my voice. I calculated this morning that I think it's 27 years since I last presented on Keynes in the public sphere. So hopefully by the end of my presentation, my return to Keynes, I will have justified why I've come back to Keynes, and looking at Keynes hopefully from a newish perspective, or with regard to what I call the Cambridge Revolt against formalism. The background and motivation for this presentation and for my return to Keynes and research in the philosophical methodological aspects of Keynes's economics, very much inspired by Jeff Harcourt, who has always stressed that within the Cambridge economic tradition, a key element in that has been a strong philosophical dimension. And throughout my academic life, I think that's been very evident in what I've called the emergence of the new Keynesian fundamentalism. In the late 70s, early 1980s, I was fortunate to do my MPhil in Cambridge in 1982, just as this work with regard to setting Keynes's later economics in the context of his earlier work on philosophy and probability, the work, the path-breaking work of Gay Meeks, Anna Carabelli, Rod O'Donnell, Tony Lawson, and how that work set about giving us a whole, trying to give us a whole new perspective really on the aspects of uncertainty, and ultimately leading in, I think it's fair to say, into the concerns we now have with the ontological dimensions of economics. All of that started to emerge, and I think reinforced the fact that Cambridge economists have always had a strong concern for the philosophical basis of the subject. But one of the things that came through, and again, I was fortunate that within my MPhil year group was an amazing philosopher economist, John Coates. And John stayed on, did his PhD on the relationship between Keynes and Wittgenstein, and ultimately in 1996 published that work in a book, The Claims of Common Sense. And what the key message that came out of John's book, and it has been a sort of launch point for my revisiting Keynes, is that possibly we've got it somewhat wrong in taking the treatise of probability as an appropriate philosophical setting for the understanding of the general theory. Because as I'll pick up later, John's argument really is that a treatise on probability is an artifact of pre-World War I analytical philosophy, and really maybe the most appropriate philosophical perspective for Keynes, context for Keynes's later economics, is the later philosophy of Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein's concern for the vagueness of the social sciences. So that's really my background and motivation for this research and for this talk. And the main propositions that, if you like, the agenda I've set myself in my research in the coming years is really to look at these 5 basic propositions. That Cambridge philosophy in the 1930s was characterized by a revolt against analytic philosophy, i.e. formalism. There was a parallel but somewhat earlier revolt against formalism in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which had experienced a much long-standing revolt against formalism through the emergence of the American classical pragmatism that dates back to the 1870s. A third proposition, that American classical pragmatism had an important influence on both Ramsay and Wittgenstein. And then that leads on to the next proposition, that Straffer, Ramsay and Wittgenstein were important influences on Keynes's later philosophy, both directly and indirectly. So that the conclusion I reach is that Keynes's general theory is more appropriate and more appropriately interpreted in the context of the Cambridge Revolt against formalism in the 1920s and 1930s in particular, rather than the pre-war philosophical debates within the analytical philosophy of the pre-war, pre-First World War years in Cambridge. That's not to say that there is not much to be gained from an understanding of the treatise of probability as it emerges and influences the general theory, but the understanding needs to be more nuanced to take account of the change in philosophical context in which Keynes was working in the 1930s compared to when his work on probability started as an undergraduate in the early part of the century. So I use the term formalism. I've got it in the title. That pushes me to come up with a definition of formalism. It's a term that's widely used. I recently reread Anna Carabelli's path-breaking work on Keynes's method. She uses the term formalism. It's very widely used. What I'm meaning by formalism is that it's the application of reason to reveal the inner logic of the external world. And indeed, I've come up with what I've attempted to try and come up with a graphic visualization of what I mean by formalism and where I'm locating Keynes in as regards the revolt against formalism. So I've suggested effectively a four-quadrant diagram with up in the northwest quadrant formalism, and that quadrant being characterized by a concern with reason, the application of reason as a solitary individual, consciousness, to represent the world, to understand the inner logic of the world. And within that, there was almost a move, if you like, into a hyper-formalism, what's sometimes called linguistic turn. I've called it the linguistic turn one, where you get the emergence of analytic philosophy with a concern to develop almost an ideal language for representing the external world in a logical manner. And key elements within that would be Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, would be Wittgenstein's Tractatus. I'd also position Keynes's A Treatise on Probability and Moore's Principia Ethica in that, within that zone as the, if you like, the four outstanding works of analytic philosophy within Cambridge, England. And what I'm arguing is that if we look at the philosophical developments within Cambridge post First World War I, we see a move in this revolt against formalism, and I'm going to use as, if you like, the polar opposite of formalism as a term I'm going to use and explain further, pragmatism. And what I'm taking at a very general level by the term pragmatism is an understanding of socially aware human beings, hence the emphasis on communication, going about the everyday business of life. So it's about the philosophy of engagement rather than the philosophy of representation. And I'm going to argue that it's that within this southeast quadrant, this is where you find the work of Ramsay developing. This is the later Wittgenstein. And this, following John Coates's arguments, this is the context, philosophical context in which we need to place Keynes's general theory. I've described formalism, if you like, to the essence of formalism, I think, was captured so well by the pragmatist Dewey when he described formalism as the spectator theory of the world, that isolated individual that's conscious but set back from the world. It's the Cartesian project, and as I said, that it's that formalism. That's the philosophical context originally of the treatise of probability. It's not the philosophical context of the general theory. So really, I'm arguing that there have been two Cambridge revolts against formalism: the Cambridge, Massachusetts revolt in the form of the emergence of American classical pragmatism in what was ironically called, it was a get-together of radical philosophers. They called it, it was a conversational club, they called it the Metaphysical Club, very much opposed to the European foundational philosophy. And the revolt against formalism in Cambridge, England, emerged in the 1920s and 30s, and a rejection of the phrase Russell analytic philosophy and this formulation of ideal language, particularly also Wittgenstein's, the early Wittgenstein and the work of the Tractatus. And I think one thing that comes through in reading the developments of the pragmatism in the US, as well as the developments of philosophy in Cambridge, England in the 1920s and 1930s, is I think it's no coincidence that both of these anti-formalist movements emerged in the immediate aftermath of hugely traumatic war experiences, the American Civil War, the First World War, in a sense that those traumatic events that ripped up, in a sense, the basis of civilizations in some ways, that Keynes describes so well in My Early Beliefs. I think it's no coincidence that the anti-formalism of pragmatism and the anti-formalism of Wittgenstein and Ramsay and others and Keynes comes through in the immediate aftermath of traumatic war experiences. So within Cambridge, Massachusetts, the anti-formalism of the American classical pragmatism, the three key figures are Peirce, James, and Dewey. It's impossible in a slide, in a presentation, possibly possible in a book, to capture the breadth and width and depth of their philosophical positions. Peirce, probably best known for the statement of the pragmatic maxim that our beliefs, theories, and concepts are linked to experience, practice, expectations, or consequences. James, famously, but for some infamously, associate with the notion that truth is whatever works, truth is whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief. And John Dewey, a lifelong concern about the human predicament and this quest for certainty as a quest for an assured peace, unqualified by risk and the fear involved in action. Putnam in 1995 published a paper in which he identified 4 characteristic theses of pragmatism. That doubt must be justified, our beliefs are fallible, there's no fact-value dichotomy, and practice is primary in philosophy. And Putnam's argument is that those 4 theses, despite some deep divides within pragmatism, both in its early stages and the classical pragmatism, and as it developed throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, those 4 characteristic theses have been held in one form or other by all of those who would consider themselves pragmatists. One I think a noticeable absentee from Putnam's characterization of pragmatism is any thesis or agreed thesis on the nature of truth. And indeed, an understanding of American classical pragmatism at root there, and I think it remains a characteristic throughout the development of pragmatism, is the profound disagreement on the nature of truth. With Peirce putting a lot more stress on getting it right, and James putting a stress on what works. I think Peirce stressed both usefulness and getting it right, and put a great deal of stress on getting it right, whereas James, as I said, famously or infamously for some, is very much seen as taking the stance that truth is whatever works. When we look at the anti-formalism of Cambridge, England in the 1920s and 1930s, The three key individuals in that anti-formalism at the philosophical level are Sraffa, Ramsay and Wittgenstein. The standard story is that Russell Moore and Wittgenstein's savage pragmatism, that Ramsay and Wittgenstein developed novel positions, but they were primarily influenced within the local Cambridge circle, and that the work of Ramsay cut so tragically short, and Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, their development of novel positions were very much insular, wasn't really impacted by what was going on outside Cambridge, England. Recent work over the last decade, I've been influenced strongly by the work of Cheryl Missack, a Canadian philosopher who has published some key works on the development of American pragmatism in 2016, then focused attention on the links between American pragmatism and what was happening in Cambridge, England. And she provides an alternative story. And her story is really that Ramsay was a proponent of the most compelling version of pragmatism associated with C.S. Peirce. And from Missack's perspective, the compelling version of pragmatism associated with Peirce is a pragmatism that puts an emphasis on getting it right, as well as what is useful, but getting it right, and the two go hand in hand. So she very much comes from the supportive of the Peirce tradition within pragmatism, as opposed to the James tradition, if we want to put it that way. And the second part of the story that she stresses, and indeed she's now published a mighty tome, biographical tome on Frank Ramsay, is that Ramsay's pragmatic objections to the tractation, are largely responsible for Wittgenstein's turn towards ordinary language. So Missack sees a key role for Ramsay in influencing Wittgenstein, and importantly, between them, the role of Sraffa, which Amartya Sen has written on. When it comes to contextualizing Keynes within the Cambridge Revolt of Formalism, as I said earlier, by way of introduction, a key source there is John Coates's work on the claims of common sense, where, as I said, he sees the treatise of probability as very much an artifact of earlier Cambridge analytic philosophy, documents and provides a huge amount of evidence that Keynes was influenced by Wittgenstein during lengthy conversations over the period 1929 to 1933, that Keynes, as a result, adopted Wittgenstein's concept of vagueness, and really, from Coates argues that Keynes was very much the first person in the social sciences to really apply and operationalize Wittgenstein's notions of vagueness. It comes through in Keynes, the emphasis both in his lectures in the early 30s, as well as in the general theory, the emphasis he puts on defining concepts in the general theory and trying to define concepts as closely as possible to their common usage to allow for the wider application of his economic theory. And also, Coates picks up, and I'll come back to this, that Keynes differentiates between generalizing and generalization, and he means by generalizing thinking by sample, and he differentiates that quite clearly from what he calls generalization, and we'll come back to that right at the end. So from that context, and borrowing that distinction that emerged in the comment in Ramsay and Keynes's commentary and response to Ramsay, the treatise of probability is an artifact of analytical philosophy and its formal logic, whereas the general theory is more appropriately seen as the application of pragmatism to economics. So to borrow from Ramsay's terminology, that the general theory is human logic as opposed to a treatise of probability being formal logic. And a good example of that transition in context and perspective is looking at the weight of argument. which seems to me a paradigm example of that transition from formal to human logic that we see between the treatise on probability and the general theory, where we find, after defining the weight of argument in the treatise of probability, Keynes expresses doubts on its practical significance, but by the time of the general theory, we've got its pragmatic counterpart playing a key role, namely the state of confidence, which is crucial in chapter 12 of the general theory, impacting on investment and employment via the state of long-term expectations. So I think that transition from the weight of argument as an analytic concept to state of confidence as a pragmatic concept is a key exemplar, I should say, of this move in perspective from the treatise of probability to the general theory. So why does it matter, just to round up, and hopefully I've kept reasonably on time. At the core of pragmatism is the link between beliefs and actions in everyday life. Recognizing that the pragmatism of Keynes's later philosophical and economic thought that came via the influence of Ramsay, the influence of Wittgenstein, to some extent the influence of Schaffer, that link between beliefs and actions impacts at two levels in Keynes. First of all, what I'd call the first order impact is the notion of belief-based action. That economic behavior depends on our beliefs about the situation in which we find ourselves. And when you look at the core structure of the general theory and stand back from it, what you see is an extensive discussion on how beliefs impact on the consumption decision of individuals, an extensive discussion how beliefs impact on the investment decision in firms. At the core of the general theory is belief-based action. It's a very, very pragmatic perspective. And an implication of that is that every economic decision is to some degree unique in its context. And that's where Keynes's insistence on generalizing his thinking by sample is the method that's required, not by generalization. So there's a recognition running through Keynes, and I think it's this that's emphasized in part by John Coates, that the need to think by sample, to build up, to generalize, a bottom-up approach by thinking by sample and recognizing the contextual aspects. So the samples are specific contexts. Generalization, to some extent, is about decontextualizing. Keynes's method, what runs through Keynes's method, is trying to generalize, to think across samples, but at the same time recognizing the important contextual aspects of each individual context. The second order impact, and it runs through pragmatic philosophy and the pragmatism, is to turn pragmatism on itself, to think about meta-beliefs. It's not just about belief-based action, but it's also recognizing the beliefs we have about our own beliefs, to be aware, self-aware, and reflective on what we believe about our beliefs, and recognizing that beliefs are fallible, they're always liable to doubt. Just as Putnam recognized, a key characteristic running through pragmatic thought is the importance of that doubt must be justified, it must be specific and justified. And this more than anything is the direct pragmatic rejection of the Cartesian project. That's where Descartes started, from generalized doubt and tried to build knowledge. That the pragmatic project is that doubt must be specific, not general, but must be specific and justified. Self-awareness of the nature of beliefs implies that then that action can never be just a matter of calculation, and that kind of self-awareness runs throughout chapter 12 of the general theory and the discussion of investment. So ultimately, what I'm arguing is that the Cambridge economic tradition has been characterized by a strong philosophical dimension. in my gap, if you like, of 27 years, the philosophical dimension has become stronger and stronger in the particularly in the emergence and development of critical realism and Cambridge social ontology associated with the work of Tony Lawson. My argument would be that the philosophical dimension could be further strengthened by greater recognition of the influence of pragmatic and contextual dependent approaches of Ramsay and Wittgenstein and how they impacted on Keynes's later philosophical and economic writings. So I think we've tended to stick to the standard story, be very critical of pragmatism, often see pragmatism as linked to instrumentalism and Friedman type methodology. There's much within the pragmatic philosophy that fits with the heterodox positions that we adopt, that can complement ontological arguments. And I think there is an increasing body of evidence to show that pragmatism had a deep and significant influence on Ramsay, on the later Wittgenstein, and via Ramsay and Wittgenstein on Keynes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that that fascinating talk. I also read your paper, which I enjoyed very much. Anything that discusses a revolt against analytic philosophy is going to be okay by me. We have a few questions, but exploiting my role as chair, I would like to begin by asking one. I mean, in the paper, so there's, you know, you identify that this philosophical dimension has continued, particularly through the work of Tony Lawson. My memory of the paper is that you also suggest that Lawson's work, and I guess the Cambridge Social Ontology Project more generally, continues this revolt against formalism. And I wondered if you might be able to expand on that a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, as I say, I've got a sense of relief now. But as I say, I was very, very fortunate to come to Cambridge to do the MPhil in 82, 83 with, you know, one of the first seminars I attended was Rod O'Donnell's seminar in philosophy. Before, he just completed and defended his PhD thesis and was heading back to Australia, and Jeff Harcourt sort of rounded up. Jeff had just got back to Cambridge. He rounded up the troops from the MPhil, people like myself and John Coates and others, to go along to Rod. And, you know, and one of the wonderful things about being Cambridge at that point in time, because Gay Meeks doing Gay's philosophical issues, and I've continued to keep in touch with Gay. She was and Tony's work, who, you know, looking at the I won't say transition, the development of Tony's work, you know, epitomizes, I think, although coming out of his analysis of the risk and uncertainty and probabilistic aspects of Keynes, and really picking up on what Keynes had to say on the atomistic and organicism. And Tony really was one of the first to really pick up on that and led into critical realism and into Cambridge social ontology. So I look very much as Tony's work as showing the complementarity of, you know, the absolute crucial importance of ontology. In fact, as preparation, I went back and reread your paper, Yannick, from a couple of years ago, where, you know, you outline so very well what Tony had to say in terms of the role of ontology in defining heterodox economics. So I see going back and looking at having a revisit of Ramsay and Wittgenstein and trying to put what they said, linking particularly what Ramsay had to say, putting that more in the context of and recognition of the influence of Peirce on Ramsay, that I think that's an important additional branch of development that has enormous potential. Because ultimately, if we if you strip it away, pragmatism is ultimately about understanding, doing philosophy to understand better, to help us be better and to do better. And I think that strand complements that comes through in Keynes, and it's opened my eyes to, to reread Keynes and get things out of Keynes that possibly I hadn't got out previously. So I'm wholeheartedly want to argue that bringing a more pragmatic philosophy to the table should act as a complement. And indeed, Keynes embodies a concern for organicism and a rejection of the atomistic assumption for the social world. I think as I read the general theory now, embodies both that alongside this concern for a much more pragmatic approach, pragmatic with a capital P.
Great, thanks, Bill. You'll probably like some of Stephen Pratton's recent work where he draws links between social positioning and pragmatism, and I guess Cambridge social ontology and pragmatism more generally. But I should turn to some questions from other people and not just hog the whole time. Jamie Morgan asks what you think of Patrick Bayer's work or Nicholas Resch's different strands of pragmatism. He wondered if, you had views on either of those authors' work.
Now, at the moment, where I've gone to is actually gone right back to the very start. So I've immersed myself in particularly in trying to understand the work of C.S. Peirce, since the route I'm trying to follow in the paper, as that I've tried to set out, was that it's really a position paper, an agenda. The route I'm trying to follow at the moment is very much to look at the relationship between Peirce, Ramsay and Keynes and go down that line. At the same time, trying to take a broader perspective on the pragmatism. And I should say that at the moment, I've been very much influenced, as I've noted in the presentation, by Putnam. I'm also been particularly influenced, apart from Misak, by Richard Bernstein's who's worked with and in pragmatism for the last 50, 60 years, really. So I've been, heavily influenced in my perceptions of the modern pragmatism by Bernstein, and I do find myself more of a, if you like, a Peircean in the sense of an emphasis on getting it right. So I tend to go with Rorty's critique in terms of modern pragmatism. I go with a lot of Rorty's critique, but not where I don't entirely share his path of journey, which to me is, I think I agree with Misak on that point, that he's much more in the James style. I ultimately, come back to that it's not we're looking for an understanding and beliefs that in some ways get it right with a small r, that fit with our experiences and are useful. And I'm quite taken with the Ramsay argument that really, in the context of probability, that very pragmatic attitude that belief is about taking a set of possibilities and ruling possibilities out. And that was his underlying approach to probability. And I think it's very, very pragmatic and very piercing.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to check if Jana managed to come back onto the call so that I can know whether there might be time to ask them further. Yes, you are back. Well, maybe I'll ask a final question to Bill, and then we can return to you to come back to. So, well, I guess it's a final 4 questions. Anna Carabelli has asked, I'll read them out in turn. So I think these are questioning some of your reading of Keynes. So here we go. Question 1 is, what about Keynes's dislike of Wittgenstein's Tractatus? What about Keynes's rebuttal of Russell's logic of implication? What about if in A Treatise on Probability, Keynes follows the common sense line of thought of Thomas Reid More based on ordinary language? And 4, what about if your whole story is totally reversed? Keynes could be the starting point of the notion of vagueness and incommensurability and complexity without using Ramsey's Humean reasoning on usefulness and instrumental rationality. So there you go, a couple of easy ones to end.
Right, I'm very intrigued by the last one, and very open. Sorry, can I understand? Were all these questions from Anna?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the great scholars of Keynes's philosophy and methodological, and always find fascinating what Anna has to say. I'm very intrigued by the way I've presented it. I've followed a story of Ramsey to Wittgenstein, and those influenced Keynes. I cannot believe it was a one-way relationship, that Keynes's mind was he was never going to be a receptacle. It was always yes, the emphasis certainly has been on looking at how Ramsey and Wittgenstein influenced Keynes. I think that is an incredibly important corrective. That it's clearly my focus initially is revisiting Keynes, Ramsey, and just a rereading of Keynes's reaction to Ramsey, as well as a rereading of Ramsey. But I'm certainly open, very, very open to that. It was a two-way conversation between Keynes and Wittgenstein, and that much in the way that Straffer, and Marta Sen gets across very well. I think much in the way that Straffer, in a sense, the argument that I take from Marta is that effectively what the later Wittgenstein was, he discovered where Gramsci and Straffer and other leading Italian radical philosophers had got to in the early 20s. So yeah, I'm more than happy to continue the conversation with Anna. As I said, I have in recent weeks been busily rereading Anna's original work on Keynes's method, and I don't think much of what my initial reaction to much of what Anna said is that I'm open to developing my understanding to embrace those perspectives. As I said, I've picked up on the last one, but yeah, very open to following those paths where possible.
Great. Well, thanks, Bill. Given that we're running out of time a little bit, maybe continuing that discussion with Anna at another